Welcome back to 326B, the 19th century transformation of Western medicine. This is the beginning part of Module 3. In Module 2, we discussed the Paris School of Medicine, which was premised around the birth of the large hospitals, which gave access to live and dead bodies, and focused in on a clinical approach. We also saw the advent of such things as tissue pathology and clinical trials. Now, in the first part of Module 3, we're going to move on to talk about disease etiology. Etiology just means causation. So, how people thought they became sick in the first place. And for the first part of the 19th century, in fact, for 3/4 of the 19th century, disease etiology focused around the miasmatic theory. So, what is the miasmatic theory of disease? The miasmatic theory is the belief that disease is caused by stench. For example, when trash or waste rots, this organic decay emits fumes or noxious odors that, when breathed in, cause a person to fall ill. Now, this view of disease being caused by a local stink fits very well within the humoral medical idea as well. So let's say you live in an area where human and animal waste has piled up, and the smell is absolutely breathtaking in a bad way. People who believed in miasmatic theory of disease causation and humoral medicine thought that the intense odors could disrupt and unbalance your natural state of health. So if you think back to that humoral chart that we looked at in Module 1, the stink makes your natural state of health drift into an unnatural state and you get sick. So you see here on the slide, the patient, when she's healthy, she's dry and somewhat balanced between hot and cold. This is where she's healthy. But then, if she's exposed to some stinking miasma, this causes her natural humoral balance to become unbalanced. She drifts into an area where she's not supposed to be on the humoral chart, and that for her is illness. The miasmatic theory was not new in the early 1800s. It had been around for hundreds and hundreds of years and functioned alongside Galenic humoral medicine as far back as the ancient Greeks and Romans. In fact, during the bubonic plague outbreaks of the late 1300s through the 14 and 1500s, people desperately tried to prevent themselves from breathing in stinking air, which they thought was what was causing the plague. Now, in the slide here, you see a picture of a bubonic plague doctor from the 1400s, and you notice that he's wearing this mask that has this very long beak on it. Well, the beak has a purpose, and the purpose is that it's filled with things like orange peels and cloves and cinnamon sticks, anything that smells good, which can filter the stench. The doctor also carries a long stick that he can use for pointing and also to keep smelly people away from him. And he wears a robe and hat that are coated in oil. And again, that's to keep the odor from permeating the clothing that he's wearing underneath. Again, the belief that it's the stench that's causing the illness. In the smaller picture there, you see a doctor even carrying incense cones on a stick that are burning, and he's sort of wafting them back and forth, and the smoke is sort of cleansing the air. They would think. So you have to remember, if you can't smell it, you can't get sick from it. Now, the miasmatic theory in the 1800s, the 19th century, was often referred to as anti-contagionism. In other words, the belief was that disease was not contagious. Disease was caused by a local condition of bad air or smelliness. In fact, the most ardent believers in anti-contagionism claimed that contagionism, or the belief that disease could be spread person to person, was a superstition. Now, in these pictures, you see central London in the early 1800s, and you see the children there playing in this pile of trash and human feces. These piles of trash and feces were called middens, and the children would play in them and build forts in them, much in the same way that we would today play in the snow. You also see there a picture of a little boy down on the docks at the River Thames in London, and he's being confronted by a miasmatic stink monster that's rising out of the Thames. And you notice he's covered with trash and even has the corpse of a dead cat stuck on his back. So, again, the idea that anything that's stinking is what's causing the disease. One of the most fervent believers in the miasmatic theory and in anti contagionism was the nurse Florence Nightingale. Florence Nightingale was a very wealthy English woman who took a great interest in caring for the sick, which she believed was a calling from God. She did many things in her life. Probably the most important was that she established nursing as a noble profession for proper ladies. Before Nightingale, there really weren't nurses as a profession to care for the sick, other than people who belonged to religious orders who knew very little about medicine and, in fact, often viewed their patients' suffering as a way for them to become closer to God. Nightingale believed that nurses were professionals who were there to ease their patients' pain and, if possible, see them to a cure. One of the major changes that Nightingale instituted was the redesign of the hospital, redesigning them to eliminate the dangers of miasmatic stench. New wards had large floor to ceiling windows, large aisles, and spaces between the individual beds. Nightingale believed that the flow of fresh air eliminated the dangers of miasma. For this class, our interest in Florence Nightingale begins during the Crimean War. The Crimean War was a war between European powers and Tsarist Russia that took place in southern Russia in the 1850s. The casualties from the war were astronomically high on all sides, but mostly due to disease, not to war-related injuries. Florence Nightingale used her important connections to be appointed as head nurse of the British armies in the Crimea. Her main goal was to eliminate miasma, which she viewed as the main cause of disease and death. To do this, she instituted the same reforms that she had advocated for in London. She opened up large wards with fresh air, insisted on hand washing, and had the army dig new latrines at a proper distance from the camps. Again, thinking about stench, not about germs. So in the slide here, we see when Nightingale arrived in the Crimea, the rate of death from disease was very, very high. 900,000 troops had died, and 80% of all British deaths were from disease. Now, Nightingale and her nurses reorganized the wards, and again, her goal was to eliminate stench and to get rid of miasma. The death rate in the military hospital wards indeed dropped from 42% to 2%, so a very large drop, which she associated with ridding the wards of miasma, but which we know today would have been because she was actually ridding the wards of germs. Now let's turn our attention to one of the great 19th century epidemics most closely associated with the miasmatic theory, and that would be cholera. Cholera is a disease caused by a bacterial infection, which is transmitted by oral fecal route. In other words, you must ingest food or water that has been contaminated by the infected fecal matter of a cholera patient. The disease is endemic to the Indian subcontinent, notably the delta of the Ganges and Brahmaputra rivers. Cholera has existed in that region for thousands of years, and it still does. However, in the 19th century, Cholera made its first appearance outside of these normal zones of infection and swept the entire globe in successive waves, arriving decade after decade. Now, as a bacterium, cholera vibrio is actually considered extremely delicate and doesn't travel so well, which is why it had been isolated to the Indian subcontinent for thousands and thousands of years with little spread to the outside world. However, the 19th century saw social and technological developments that would help cholera escape from its confines in India. The first of these was settler colonialism on the Indian subcontinent by British troops. This meant that large number of troops were being deployed to India and then moved throughout the rest of the British Empire or even back to Britain. Ordinarily, this would not have been problematic, as the infected troops would have just died off before their arrival in the next port, and certainly before the long journey back to the British Isles. But the early 19th century also saw remarkable technological advances in troop and civilian movement with the invention of the railroad and the steamship. Journeys that once took months and months could be completed in days or even hours. Add to this the opening of the Suez Canal in 1860, and human movement became fairly rapid. So we can imagine a scenario in which British troops located in a relatively remote area in India become infected with cholera. These troops take the railroad to a port city where they board a steamship to another port city. They take the infection with them, infecting cities port by port. The steamship makes its way back to Europe, and once the infected passengers debark in an average European city, they have arrived in the perfect breeding ground for cholera. So I just said that European cities were the perfect breeding grounds for cholera, which is difficult to imagine for those of us who have seen the beautiful cities of Paris, London, and Rome. But life just 200 years ago was very different. Europe and the new nation, the United States, were rapidly industrializing, and the urban populations were growing at an alarming rate, including in cities like New York, which is the subject of your reading in the cholera years. People began leaving the countryside to seek opportunities in the cities, especially to work in the new factories that were springing up like mushrooms across the urban landscape. In New York, an additional major factor to rapid population increase was massive immigration. Now, here in the slide, you see prior to the Industrial Revolution, people worked in small artisanal shops that often employed, 3 or 4, 5 people maximum, doing things like hat making and crafting leather or dyeing or working as silversmiths or ironmongers. Um, by the time we get to the 1800s, all of this is becoming mechanized and moved into factories where people work in very large groups of people working in close confines where disease can easily be spread, and also in conditions that are crowded, pay is low, and fresh food is scarce.